Welcome back to AP US History. This is part 2 in chapter 19. By the way, the secret word for this chapter is robber barons. These were the wealthy men who controlled American industry, who controlled politicians, built America, uh, catapulted it to the number one industrial power in the world, but at the expense of the environment, competition, and workers. Um, why this took place, why the United States became the industrial power it did. Certainly, we looked at the railroads. We looked at somewhat at the fact the government had a hands-off policy or laissez-faire attitude towards business. Let them do what they want to do. If it's good for big business, it's good for America, which wasn't necessarily true. We looked at the big monopolies that were created, a lot of corporate mergers during the last part of the 19th century. Eventually, because of the abuses, the government will institute some regulations on big business, and the first thing that they will regulate is railroads, which leads the Industrial Revolution. Uh, are there modern day rubber barons? Yes. The mega corporations, the conglomerates that control the industry throughout the world, uh, building things at the cheapest price and exploiting workers throughout the world. Uh, there is a thirst for manufactured goods, and people want to pay the cheapest price they can, and corporations want to make the most profits they can. The first regulation comes about because really the farmers in the West are sick and tired of the railroads uh, jacking the prices up, making it very difficult for farmers to exist. You have to remember that hogs and cattle and grain needed to be shipped by rail, and the railroads knew that they had a monopoly on geographic areas and they could charge farmers whatever they wanted to. Um, of course, there were people who believed that there should be no regulation of business. It was really a dog eat dog world. It was survival of the fittest. Charles Darwin comes up with the origin of species, and this is going to be applied to businesses. He said it was survival of the fittest. And in a free market system, only those companies that were most fit would survive. Herbert Spencer is going to be a man who puts forth this concept of social Darwinism. He says that through natural selection and human competition, that some companies will survive and others won't. He was a British economist, certainly an advocate of laissez-faire, keep your hands off businesses. The notion that survival of the fittest was the way a free capitalist society worked. Other men who agreed with him, this was an American, William Graham Sumner. Individuals have absolute freedom to struggle, succeed, or fail. So if Rockefeller was able to control 90% of all the refineries in America at any way that he could do it, well, good for him. And he was going to be handsomely rewarded for that. But society would benefit from such men, and we should not try to interfere. Uh, he wrote what social classes owe to each other, uh, telling really that millionaires are a product of natural selection and that they're good for America. Andrew Carnegie came up with the gospel of wealth. He built the U.S. Steel into the largest steel producing company in the world. He believed that it was God's will that he was wealthy. He did give money away for public projects. Um, Wealth was good for society, um, and if you had to break the backs of unions, the workers to do it, so much the better. Uh, he believed that the Anglo-Saxon race was superior. Um, Inequality is inevitable and good. Wealthy should act as trustees for their poorer brethren. He would never suggest that you give money directly to people, but provide civic projects and so forth to make society better. At the end of his life, he attempted to give away all of his wealth. At his family's chagrin, they were a little upset with him, tried to have him declared mentally unstable. This gospel of wealth, Russell Conwell, wealth is no longer looked on as something evil, viewed as a sign of God's approval. It was a Christian's duty to accumulate wealth, and you should not help the poor. Now, the first regulation that's going to be instituted by the federal government is the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. It's going to make an attempt to regulate the prices that railroads charge. Railroads were in the business of giving rebates to favored customers, changing the rates on how much it costs to transport goods from one location to another. It was just a sliding scale. There was nothing that was posted. You never knew exactly what they were going to charge. This particular act forbade unfair price discrimination. You had to charge people the same rate, whether you were small or large companies or just individuals. Set up the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce the law. This was in a direct response to the Grange movement. This was an organization of farmers protesting against the railroads. Many of the Grangers, the farmers in the West, wanted the railroads to be owned by the federal government, which never happens. Although there was a brief period during World War I where the government does take over railroads for a short time. The next law that was passed was the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was supposed to stop trusts and monopolies. It forbid combinations that would restrict competition. There was no distinction between a good monopoly or bad monopoly. It was just all monopolies were seen as evil. Largely ineffective, mainly because they had no enforcement agency. Most of the corporations will eventually use the Sherman Antitrust Act to fight unions, saying that there are an infringement on competition and that they should be banned. And the courts will go along with that for a while. As far as unions coming about, it was because of the foul treatment of these moguls, these rich millionaires, these people who were building huge businesses at whatever cost and expense on humanity it would bring about. They cared nothing for the workers. They worked in long hours at low wages, poor working conditions, really unhealthy places to be. Workers were expendable. If someone got hurt on the job, they were just fired and they were replaced by someone else. Strikes, if the workers did try to strike, they would hire what they called scab workers who would break the unions. Most of the courts were in favor of the corporations, so the government was stacked against them, and the laws seemed to be on their side. But unions will slowly grow in America towards the end of the 19th century. It isn't really going to be until the middle 20th century that unions really have a strong foothold in America. There were also workers were assigned yellow dog contracts, which said that they would never join a union or try to create one. This shows a graph of labor distribution from 1870 to 1900, and you can see that the industrial section is going to grow and farmers are going to shrink. This shows again agriculture, manufacturing. You can see that the manufacturing section is growing while the agricultural sections are shrinking in terms of manpower. These huge corporations employed children. They were nothing more than expendable commodities. Children would start as early as 7 years old, 6, 7 years old, and by the time they were reached adulthood, were pretty much broken people. Management versus labor. Of course, management had a lot of things on their side. They used scab workers, public relation campaigns to make it look as though unions were bad things. Pinkertons were detectives that were hired to protect businesses from unions. Uh, the companies had lockouts where they would just close the doors and tell people to go home if they didn't agree to the company's terms. They had something called blacklisting, and that is that if you were a union organizer or sympathizer or went out on strike, you would be put on a list, fired, and then they would give your name to other companies in the same industry, and they would not hire you. Of course, we talked about the Yellow Dot contracts, which said that you couldn't join unions or create them. Courts seemed to be on their side. They would issue injunctions to stop strikes and open shops. That is, you could have a union, but you wouldn't necessarily have to join it if you didn't want to. The tools of labor, they could certainly boycott the companies. They had sympathy rallies and informational pickets. They wanted closed shops. That is, that you had to belong to the union before you could be hired by the company. They did organized strikes, and they had what they called wildcat strikes, which were local strikes brought on by local organizers. One of the first unions to be created after the Civil War was the National Labor Union. It was created in 1866. It was mostly skilled workers. It lasted for about 6 years and boasted of about 600,000 members. Its main focus was on social reform. They wanted better working conditions, an 8-hour workday. Blacks were not welcomed in the union until after 1869, so the blacks formed their own, and this was in response to the fact that the whites kept them out. The Depression of the 1870s eventually killed the union. But that was the first union in America. The Molly Maguires were a group of Irish coal miners in Pennsylvania. They were a secret fraternal organization. They used intimidation, violence to fight back at the mining interests, the owners. The Molly Maguires were eventually destroyed, and 20 members hanged in 1877. The Molly Maguires became the martyrs for the union and labor cause, but they were only on the scene for a short period of time. The companies were able to break the backs of this union. Molly Maguires, shown here, a secret, sort of a semi-secret society, workers organizing, trying to fight back against the mine owners. James McParland was their leader, but eventually they will be broken. We'll stop right there, and we'll pick this up next time in part 3.